Welcome back to IT Fundamentals Training Series. I am your host, Mark Haupt, and this is the real episode 39. Welcome back to the IT Fundamentals Training Series. I am your host, Mark Haupt, and this is the real episode 39. And you have to ask yourself, what is he talking about? Well, if you remember last episode, I called it 39. It was really 38. This is what happens when you travel a lot. You get on the road, you start missing numbers. In fact, just a little side note, I had a friend of mine who literally flew into the wrong city one time. He flew from Florida to Dallas, and he was supposed to go to Denver. That's what happens when you travel too much. You just pick the wrong city. Luckily, I haven't gotten there yet, but let's get right into what we're going to talk about today in managing the operating system. So in real episode 38 that we called 39, you remember that we talked about virtual machines and hypervisors and type 1 and type 2 hypervisors, where type 1 hypervisor is the one where the hypervisor itself is installed directly on the hardware. It's typically used in server applications. And the type 2 hypervisor is the type that's installed on top of something like your workstation operating system, which is then installed on top of the hardware, or vice versa. Actually, it would be hardware installed operating system, then the hypervisor, and then the guest operating system. That's the type 2 hypervisor. And the type 2 hypervisor is used frequently with application development testers, different kinds of testing environments like that, where you could build something up real quick and throw it away, perhaps even in gaming environments where you have a particular type of game that needs to run efficiently on one particular operating system. You can pull that up inside of a hypervisor, inside of a virtual machine, and not have to impact the rest, if you will, of your workstation. You can just shut it down and send it away. But today we're going to talk about actually managing the operating systems. We're going to start getting into something that is very near and dear to my heart, and that's the security aspect. So when we're managing operating systems, typically there's two functions that we're looking at managing inside of the operating system. First of all, the security and the access to the operating system, and then the performance of the operating system. And you know that we have talked a little bit about the performance management of the operating system in a previous setting, where you do Control-Delete and you will go into the various performance options under Task Manager and take a look at how much CPU is being utilized, how much RAM, so on and so forth. And you can turn systems off. You can allocate the proper sizes and different things along those lines as you get more advanced. But some of the features of an operating system that you want to manage are user account, which is a security function, access control, which is a security function. You want to manage applications as well, and how much resources they utilize, which technically started out as a application and resource management piece, but actually kind of goes into, if you will, into security as well. Because if you can limit the amount of RAM or even processing power, for example, that an application utilizes to just what it needs in order to function properly, then you can possibly keep some applications that may have a bug in it, or just a flaw, or even something that actually has a security situation in it. You can keep that to a minimum on your computer. Lots of times when your computer runs amok, when an application runs amok, that's an indicator of a security compromise, because it's going nuts. It's going out there, and the compromise, the hack, if you will, is utilizing as many resources as it possibly can from your computer. So that kind of is a bridge into the processes and the services. Also devices, disk management, disk space management, things like that. Those are all the features that you can manage within Windows. Now, Figure 4.14, it shows user accounts in relation to Windows 7. There hasn't been a lot of change between Windows 7 graphical user interface and Windows 11, but you will, of course, notice some differences. So as you're going through the book, keep in mind the book is a few years old, and that we're dealing with that little bit of lag in time. It does talk about Windows 10 a little bit right underneath Figure 4.14, but let's dive right into user account management. All right. So user account management is identity management. And what that means, identity, is who you are, not necessarily as a person, but as the individual logging into the computer. Now, what a lot of people, especially on workstations, don't do is they don't assign a user account individually to every single user that would access the system. However, you probably should. There's a couple of reasons for this. Number one is if you're in an office environment, you will want to be able to track some of the functions that, if not all the functions, that a particular individual user may be doing on that computer. You don't want to have a situation where somebody will sit down at a computer, start typing away, perhaps send an email, send an instant messaging or something like that under a pseudonym that you can't trace back to an individual, and then somebody else sits down at the computer and does things and so on and so forth. Now, this is also important at home, although very few people utilize user account functions at home for this type of purpose. At home, you could actually apply different privileges, and so you'll and on your computers as well, just like you would in the office. So you have an account which identifies who's logging into the computer, and then layered on top of that are what's called privileges, and essentially that is the access that the person's allowed to have. Now, at home, it's typical. Oh, you have access to the entire system, but you may have kids in your home that you don't want to have access to the entire system. For example, you may not want them to be able to install software on their system or remove software if you have some sort of internet control or some sort of filtering type of product. But the other good thing about putting privilege access onto a computer at home is, once again, if you get hacked, if there's a virus that gets on your computer, that could limit its ability to install on the computer, but also limit its function if it does get installed on the computer. So there's a lot of different reasons to have these extra privileges. And what privileges are, they're simply access to the system. At work, you absolutely want to have these types of controls in place. Now, let's turn that around a little bit and help understand the difference between identity and access. All right. In my office, I have a badge that will get me into my offices. Okay. This is an identity tool. I would walk up to the badge reader and I would put my badge up against the reader, and that badge would then talk back to our access control system to let me in the door or not let me in the door. And that is the privilege. Okay. If we're going to bring that down even further to like a home level, for example. Let's say that you have a set of keys for your car. All right. Your neighbors do not have that set of keys. So the identity and the privilege are wrapped up in that key that's associated with your car. As long as you have that key on your person or within your control, and then you utilize that on your car, your neighbor cannot get into your locked car, for example. So you therefore have the privilege. The identity is the key, and the privilege is that key access that allows you to get into that particular car, which a lot of them are now are keyed with remote fobs, not actual physical keys like this here. So in this key, as long as I have it, this is my identity to access my car. And there's an encryption piece in here. There's a sequence of numbers in here that's tied directly to that car. So it can only be used on that car. All right, so that's the privilege, is that series of numbers that allows me to access that. All right, so the book talks about 3 common levels of user or access privilege that are on typical bare bones installations of workstations. So we're not talking about offices when we talk about bare bones installations. We're pretty much here, we're talking about your home user type of situation, or if you are in a small, medium-sized business, an SMB, we're talking about a standalone computer, one that's not that's not tied to an access identity control system. So on board the base operating system of Windows, for example, you've got administrator, you've got a standard user, or what they call the user, and a guest. You'll find this type of thing even like on your Apple TV, or even when you log into Netflix, you can have identities that have particular privileges that are like this. So administrator gives you full and total access to your computer. A standard user will give you a lot of access to your computer, including read and write access, things along those lines. but it may not allow you to install a piece of software, for example, or not install it without actually typing your password is probably more the reality of it. And then the guest is a highly restricted type of environment where perhaps the only thing you can do is surf to a website. I highly recommend that those people that are not using some sort of identity and privilege or access control on their home computer probably consider doing that from a security perspective that will save you from potential viruses. You can have your administrator, but don't log in as your administrator for day-to-day operations. Log in as a standard user. Be willing to go that extra step when you actually, on the rare occasions, you do need to install software. Just go ahead and retype your password. Perhaps your kids will be on the guest account instead in order to kind of help lock down that computer and keep that computer from being utilized by the hackers or other people in less than helpful ways. All right, so on page 210, it goes on, it talks about these same types of functions with the Mac OS, and there's really nothing more to go over. It also talks about the Ubuntu user properties. So I definitely want you to read over those, but from a theory perspective, we've already got the theory. On exercise 4.1 on a Windows machine, here it will walk you through the process of creating an account. So if you want to take my advice on 4.1 and 4.2, you can go ahead and set up a user account. Now, a lot of people are going to say, oh, what happens if I forget my password? Because right now I don't have a password on my computer. Great question. Well, there's a rule in security that if you have access to the hardware, you could actually get into it. And what you could do if you forget your password, and I just suggest you use a password vault type of tool that you can have on your smartphone or other types of devices that where you could save your password in an encrypted fashion. But in that case, you can write it down, although that's the only place you should write it down. I want to be clear about that. But if you do forget your password, there are things called boot tools that will allow you to boot up into the base operating system. You know, talking about how we did virtual machines way back in the day where you would, have a boot menu or something. Well, that's the same kind of concept here. What it will do is it'll boot a virtual machine before it boots your operating system. And with that, you would be able to go in and blank out or reset the password on your Windows machine. But again, as long as you have direct access to the physical machine, you can do that. So there's plenty of those tools out there. You just got to be careful with them a little bit. All right. So going on page 215, and again, it talked about access control. We just talked about that kind of thing quite a bit. Now on 217, there's a lot of exercises in here, by the way, on 215, 216, and whatnot that I highly recommend that you work with. These are going to be very important that if you plan on being an IT professional as you move forward in your career, rather than just taking this for the fun of it and kind of, getting a little bit of an exposure type of thing. You plan on being an IT professional, this whole access control thing is something you need to really pay attention to because it's a huge, huge factor in properly operating a network and operating a computer and computer systems. All right, moving on to page 217, talking about application management. All right, now this goes back to dealing with our productivity and making sure that the applications themselves are operating and behaving, quite frankly, appropriately on a computer. Now, what this does is this introduces you to the Windows registry. Now, Windows registry, as it says there, maintains all system settings, and it usually does so in all sorts of hex codes and drop down yes, nos, ones and zeros type of stuff. So my first thing for you is this. If you're going to be an IT professional, dive into the Windows registry and know some of the stuff you can do there. If you're not going to be an IT professional, then just know that the Windows registry maintains all system settings. And I mean absolutely all system settings. You can override a setting inside of the registry that aren't even visible to you in the graphical user interface in many cases. So the problem with that is if you start managing the registry itself, you can really mess up the system. Most of the time, the registry changes. You have to do a reboot. Once you reboot, if you've messed it up, it's toast. I've actually destroyed the operating installation on multiple computers playing with the registry. So I've learned to always do a backup and be able to know where that backup is of your computer and of your registry in order to correct that. And backups are so much easier to deal with today than what they have in the past. So we'll get the backups at a later time. But the Windows registry, from the testing purposes, what you need to know is that it maintains absolutely every setting for the Windows operating system, and even some of the settings for how it interacts with the application. All right, figure 4.25 is shows program and features. So if you access program and features and you were to right click on one of these programs, you can uninstall the program, or you can tell it not, and how to behave and how to operate. So from a testing perspective, uninstalling, going to that control panel and understanding how to uninstall a program is the important function. And what I recommend is that you be very careful about what you uninstall, because you would have to reinstall it. But at the same time, this is one of the ways to fine tune your computer. If you go through that list of installed programs, you will find there's a whole bunch of programs you probably don't use because your computer manufacturer has installed those when they built the computer and sent it to you. I'll tell you, one of the first things I do whenever I buy a computer is I go through that control panel and I find all the junk that they installed, all the adware, malware. It's not really malware. I call it malware, but the adware type of things, the things that are going to phone home to the manufacturer, and I do an uninstall. Lots of things you don't even need. What that does is that frees up resources on your computer so that you can use them, and you can use that computer more efficiently, or the computer will be more efficient. So how do you get to the task manager? On page 218, it tells you that. You click start, you type task manager, and when it appears, you bring it up. Or you can do a Control-Alt-Delete and click task manager, or you could do Control-Shift-Escape. These are all different ways you can get to task manager and then be able to address the operating, or the applications that are running on the operating system, and also manipulate them, like end task, for example, inside of task manager. So that's another key point, is that there's kind of a joke in the IT world that there's 3 ways to do things within Windows, at least. There's the old Control-Alt-Delete that will reset your computer, but you also have a physical reset button on the computer. And sometimes on older computers, you can just rip the battery out of the back of it, and just different ways that you could do that. So inside of Task Manager, one of the key things that we use this for is, and we talked about this earlier, evaluating how much CPU, memory, disk space, network usage, things like that, even GPUs, that a particular application is utilizing. All right, so if you see one that's overutilizing something, you can select that application and you can click the end task button at the bottom of the task manager, and that will free that up. So sometimes software will do what we call hang. It will start running wild, for example, and taking all the memory. And that could be for a couple of different reasons. It could be that it's been hacked, it's got a bug in it. It just has been running too long and kind of run amok, if you will. That's why, honestly, it is good to reboot your computer from time to time from a complete power clear scenarios, just to kind of refresh everything. I know the Apple Mac users will say you don't ever need to do that, but let me tell you something. On my iPad and on my iPhone, I have to do that all the time. At least once or twice a week, I have to reset my iPhone just to clear up some of the things that are going on in order for it to be most efficient. You will find efficiencies when you do that. But if you wanted to do it individual application wise, you go into this task manager, you would select the application that you want to end task, and then you would click that end task button. And that's going to do what's called kill the process. Now, there's obviously another way to do that. I told you there's 3 ways to do everything, right? Or at least 3 ways to do everything. So task manager is definitely the easiest. You can do what one option is command line interface. You can look those up on Google if you need to. That's not important for the test. So one thing it talks about at the bottom of page 219 is a task scheduler. You can actually click on task scheduler or type task scheduler from the click start and then type it in. And you can schedule various cleanup tasks and things that you need to do. And in Figure 4.27 and Exercise 4.4, it walks you through that process. You can schedule it to run daily. You can schedule it to run weekly, monthly, one time, however you want to do. And this is the important thing about computers: repetitive tasks. You need to find a way for the computer to do that for you, instead of you having to remember to do it or you to do it yourself. That's an absolutely important thing. Is just let the computer do their things. That's if you can schedule it, make it happen. Be more efficient with your job. All right, this is where we're going to hold off today. We're going to break this into multiple segments tomorrow. In the real episode 40, we will talk about service management. And then that's worth a whole segment of its own, because services are a very key function within Windows operating system in particular. And then we'll talk about device management later on in episode 41. So again, for the end of episode 39, the real 39, I bid you adieu for today. Hopefully that has been a good piece of information for you to work with these task managers and access control pieces. And I look forward to working with you further. Adios.